loaded up for 5 more ways with embossing folders. I hope you all have your hands up because I have some great techniques to get the most out of your embossing folders, and I've left my personal favourite one to last. So let's crack on in with way number 1. So this follows on directly from idea number 2 in my first 5 ways of embossing folders video. And if you missed that one, then there's a link to it at the end of this one and also in the description as well. Now this idea is all about printing with paint. You have all this amazing embossed and debossed texture, so why not just get the most out of it with your mixed media projects, your art journaling, your card making projects, all of them. I mean, that texture is so gorgeous I want to eat it. Okay, so maybe not eat it, but definitely print with it. And if you're worried about messing up your embossing folders, then just keep a spritz bottle of water to hand, as you want to keep that paint on the folder wet until you've got time to properly wash it off. And an old soft toothbrush is really handy too for cleanup. Okay, let's stick with the messy and try technique number 2, letterpress or faux letterpress. So many of you commented about this technique after my first 5 ways with embossing folders video. Thank you everyone who did. It's obviously a very popular technique. So if you haven't come across this one before, the idea is that you cover one side of your embossing folder with ink, then run the embossing folder with the paper or cardstock through the die cutting machine to both print and emboss or deboss the pattern. It's a great technique, but I don't know about you, I do find it a little fiddly. So here are some tips to help, and feel free to add your own in the comments below. So if you can, use a juicy ink, so an ink pad with lots of ink on it that's easy to press out onto the surface. You also want to make sure you have good coverage on the embossing folder so that you are more likely to get good coverage once you've letterpressed it. Now sticky inks work really well as they don't bead up on the plastic embossing folder. And you can add a layer of VersaMark to the embossing folder before inking up with the colour you want to use. Sometimes that can help the ink stick to the folder. Doesn't always work, but try it out and see. Now if you keep getting a double print or ink where it shouldn't be, then what's happening is that your cardstock is moving in the folder. So the tip here is try not to move it. Easier said than done. So to limit this problem, I tend to place the cardstock on the uninked surface and then place it open on the cutting plate. Then I add the top plate as I pass it through the machine, so there's less likely time for it to move around. But if your machine won't let you do that, or you just find that really tricky to do, then just be very careful once your folder is shut that you don't move that cardstock. And don't forget you can also use paint to do this as well. Just brayer some over the surface. And you want a thin layer so it doesn't smudge into the embossing or de-embossed areas, but not so thin that it dries before you get a chance to pass it through your machine. So have a play to get a feel for it and see what works with your paints. And of course you can use embossing powder with this technique as well. So just ink up one side of the folder with embossing ink, like VersaMark, pass it through the die cutting machine as you would with other inks, then cover the inked surface on that cardstock with embossing powder and heat set as usual. So tons of different faux letterpress techniques to try out and have fun with. But what about if you have embossing folders but no die cutting machine? Well, you can always print with your inks, and let's try it first with some VersaMark and do some heat embossing. This is a great way to get some interesting textures. So first I will just press the cardstock on the inked up folder to transfer that ink. And then I'll try it with a brayer to press it down a little bit firmer. And you can have a play and see what sort of textures you can get and vary the firmness and your ink coverage on the folder to get different looks. But whilst we're at it, let's try this embossing folder printing technique with coloured ink. And again, like the letterpressing, sticky inks tend to work well as they can stick well to that folder. But still, I kind of like the bitty texture that you can get. You can still make good use of them in your projects. And we also might as well try this printing technique with our paints, as it's a slight variation on that first technique I showed you. Ooh, I like that very much. Oh, and if you're worried that you've totally messed up your embossing folder, even after cleaning it, then here is a useful tip. First, just run a tester piece of cardstock through your embossing folder in the machine just to see if the colour does rub off. And if you do have a problem, then use a very thin piece of paper, like a layout paper, over the surface you're worried about leaving a mark on from the folder. Pass it through your machine as normal with your cardstock, and if the folder does leave a mark, then it's going to leave it on that protective paper layer rather than on the surface you want to keep clean. Okay, let's put the messy stuff to one side for a minute and try technique number 4, which is texturing clay. We want something a bit 3D, so I have some air drying clay, and I'm just going to thin it out a little with my brayer before pressing it onto the embossing folder. And you can press it by hand or lightly with the brayer. You don't want to be too heavy-handed with the air drying clay. Firstly, it doesn't really need it, and secondly, if it gets too thin, it tends to disintegrate. I mean, it's easy to wash off if you need to with water, but a light press will give you a great impression. Okay, let's try it with a slightly thicker piece, and this time I'm going to close the embossing folder and press it lightly with my fingers. How cool is that? I mean, imagine that shaped into an embellishment. And it works really well with other clays as well, like Fimo for instance. And then you just bake it as the manufacturers say. So a great way of adding more texture to your clays. Okay, time for technique number 5, and probably my favourite from this bunch of ways with embossing folders. DIY texture stamps. So let me show you 3 different ways to use your embossing folder to add texture to your own stamps. Now you're going to need some craft foam for this one. So for the first demo, I'm just going to press the craft foam in the folder with my fingers. You actually get a reasonable imprint, and this is going to be fine for what we need. Right, I'm going to put another piece of foam in my folder, and this time I'm going to place the folder between some heavy books for a while. And whilst that is pressing, I'm going to die cut some foam and also hand cut another piece into a heart, just to remind you that you can make craft foam into any shape you want. And these 2 I'm going to run through the die cutting machine in the folder, but I could easily have hand pressed or book pressed these as well. Okay, let's see how the book pressed foam is doing. It wasn't under the books for very long, about 20 minutes or so, but we have a print that will do just fine, because the next thing I want to do is use a glue stick to attach the foam to some acrylic blocks and see how they stamp out. So I have one more super powered tip for you, but first let's watch the results. So please do like the video and subscribe for more art tips, tutorials and inspiration, and also share the video as well with anyone you think might find it helpful. So hands up if you're now in love with this and want to rush off and make your own DIY texture stamps. Now don't forget to take the foam off of the blocks and wash them all up at the end of your stamping session. Now if you want the stamps to be more permanent, then stick them with some permanent glue to some artboard or stiff cardboard instead. So that was my last superpowered tip for this video, but I will be back with more ways with embossing folders soon. I haven't run out of ideas yet. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch up with you again on Wednesday.